Hi, I'm here with Michael P. Michael, I wanted to thank you for sharing the story, for agreeing to talk about your experience with hospice with your father. Um, Michael, why don't you give us a little bit of background about your dad,
Yeah.
um, and tell us your story.
Yeah, my father was from Italy. He was almost 89 years old when he passed. He was a very active senior. He was always in the garden, always taking care of the house. He was a Korean War vet. So he was just a very strong 89-year-old man, almost 90-year-old man. And he fell in the middle of the night in June of 2018, broke his hip. We went to the hospital and he had surgery. He had some complications with the dementia from being in the hospital and from the medications. He also became impacted. But we got through that. And then after about 5 or 6 days, we went to a rehab facility in Brooklyn. And it was kind of a slow recovery. Like he's fallen in the past over the last couple of years, and he would kind of bounce back really quickly. But this time he wasn't really like bouncing back and taking the rehab as well as he had in the past. He also became anemic, etc. So I was there every day with him for about 6 weeks, and he eventually started walking again, had a walker, etc. And we were planning on his coming home in August. He fell in June of that year. And so I was planning all the Medicaid and all the home care because he would need assistance, etc. And then one day I showed up at the rehab center and he wasn't feeling well. His stomach was hurting. He was in a lot of distress. They didn't really notice it. They had him sitting by where the nurses were because he kind of like would be a fall risk, and
Sure.
they left him alone in the room. He would get up. And so I brought him back into the room and he was in severe pain. And, you know, one of the issues that happened there was that his urologist didn't come back to see him in like a month. And I think the catheter was infected. So his urinary catheter really became infected. I spent like most of the night there with him until they still didn't take the catheter out. And I was pleading and begging for them to take it out. And then eventually one of the nurses did. And they did all these tests, whether he had a UTI or pneumonia, etc. And they kept saying, no, we can treat him here. I said, don't you think I should bring him to the ER? Should I bring him to the hospital? And they were basically adamant about not doing that. And I think part of that is the way nursing homes and rehab centers work. They get like kind of penalized when patients go back to the hospital. It doesn't look good on their statistics, you know, like transfers to hospitals. And
Yeah.
so they try to treat them there. And I spent 9 days with him in that rehab center, and he just got worse. He was just not himself, fever on and off, just bedridden, and his energetic self was gone. And so on the ninth day, when I saw him, I said, I'm taking him to the ER. And I had to do a forced I forget what it was, discharge. Like I had to fight with the nurse,
No,
you know, the
against
rehab
medical advice.
center.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even the doctor said, you know, I'm telling you this on the side. She was a nurse practitioner, but uh, he does not look good. And it's 50-50 if he's going to make it. And I'm like, you're telling me this after 9 days, you know? It's like, and when I heard that, I was like, he's out of here. And so I got him finally discharged. We went back to the hospital where he was operated on, which was New York Presbyterian. And his heart was in complete AFib. His heart was racing, etc. And then they finally realized after a few tests that he had MRSA, and the MRSA went to his heart, and he had endocarditis, so which is a really serious heart infection.
Yeah.
And so they were giving him all these drugs and antibiotics, etc. But he had stopped eating and drinking, and he just didn't. He wasn't peaceful at all. He was crying, anxious, just not himself. And so after about a week and a half in the hospital, Like they were basically saying that, the only thing that can potentially work for him is 8 weeks of IV antibiotics
Mhm.
that can potentially cure the infection. But we would have to send him back to the rehab center with a PICC line, a catheter. He now had a stage 3, stage 4 bed sore. He was completely delirious and out of his mind, and they wanted to put in a feeding tube. And when I heard feeding tube, I'm like, oh, I can't see my father with a feeding tube.
Right.
It's like he was just like this. Like I just like I kind of freaked out when they said feeding tube, and that's when I started to realize, like, what am I going to do? And during this time, my brother was also in the hospital, and I was commuting back and forth between the two hospitals, and he wasn't able to really help me with decision making. My mother, elderly, wasn't able to help, and so I was just trying to understand what the best thing for him would be. And so I started asking them, the geriatric doctor, about hospice. And so she said that, that they would be able to do inpatient hospice there. So my fear was transferring him would just agitate him even more, and it would have just caused more distress. And so I said, okay, so you would be open to the idea of that if he's non-responding to the treatments. And so I had that option, and I kept talking to all the different, because there's so many players in the hospital system, and so there's residents and interns, cardiologists, etc. And I kept asking them, what would you do? And they all kept saying, even though the recommendation was to go back to the rehab for 8 weeks, they were saying he would need a miracle to survive. He's not eating, his kidneys are declining, etc. And so it just got to a point where I didn't want to see him suffer anymore. And I just felt like I've heard good things about hospice, and I felt like maybe that would just give him some peace. Um, and so I decided on hospice. And so that was like on a Monday. They started giving him morphine hourly, Haldol every 4 hours, and I'm sorry, Haldol twice a day, and then Ativan every 4 hours. And so my experience with hospice was basically thinking that it would be something where the person would still be awake and conscious and be able to speak to you and be able to have a very peaceful death, etc. This is the part of hospice I didn't like so much, because once they started the meds, he never woke up. And so we never really had a chance to say goodbye. And so the pros and the cons are, the pros were he wasn't suffering anymore. He wasn't aware of his pain, etc. But the con is, we never said goodbye to him, and he never really was able to say goodbye to us. And so that's kind of stayed with me for 18 months, that part. I've gone through grief counseling, I've gone through the personal counseling with it, but it doesn't go away, that part, because right before they started the meds, he was asking me to take him home. In his delirium, he was asking me to take him home, get him out of bed, etc. But I just felt like that was, with MRSA, which was very contagious, etc. It just would have been too much. And so I'm torn about it. I'm grateful that it resolved his suffering, but I also question whether maybe I should have tried the 8 weeks in the rehab, even though he probably would have suffered a lot. Even if he got better, it would have been a long process for someone at that age. So I'm on the fence about it. I'm
Yeah.
on the fence about it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's hard, Michael. I mean, you can, unfortunately, hindsight, you can go back and question every single decision
Yeah.
you make, and
Right.
you're never going to know, what was right.
Yeah.
You just have
Right.
to know you're
Exactly.
working with making the best decision with the information you have at that
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. 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 I mean, I feel like I'm more equipped now to ask better questions for,
Mhm.
like, let's say it's my mother, like, where I would maybe say, don't use as much medication, so that she's more conscious, so that I can see if she's able to like be able to speak to us without having pain and in distress, I might try that. Or I mean, maybe being not being conscious is a good thing too. So I'm torn about that as well, you
Yeah,
know.
and that's a good thing you bring up. If if someone were in your shoes and they
Yeah.
were had that choice on the table, they needed to make a decision about hospice. Is there any questions or any suggestions that you would have for them? Like,
Yeah, I mean, that's the first thing. I mean, I'm part of that many Facebook groups with hospice, and I always say, just make sure you understand, you know, what the medications can do. You know, you might not be able to wake them up if they're giving them large doses or even therapeutic doses of these medications. They may not wake up again, and just, you know, potentially ask if they could, you know, titrate up so that they don't like go unconscious like quickly. You know, and also potentially ask if you can continue with other treatments while you're on like we were told that he had to stop the antibiotics because of the Medicare, and so the antibiotics are life-saving in his case with endocarditis. So just being aware of that. Like I wasn't even aware that they did that. Like I read it, I got all the medical records and I read it afterwards. So I wasn't even aware of that piece. And that piece also was hard to read because you feel like that was his lifeline, the antibiotics, and you don't realize that they're stopping them because that's kind of a Medicare stipulation, I think.
yeah,
So it's just, but the way the person is medicated, I think, is probably the most important. I was also told by the doctor, who I actually loved, that he would be conscious throughout the whole, you know, process, and that never happened. I did a post mortem with the hospice director where I spent actually about an hour going through his case, you know, with her, and she, you know, really does feel that he was at end of life,
mhm,
but because that's the part that I question, and she feels that that doctor should have never told me that he would be conscious throughout, because it may not even be the medications doing that. It may just be the end of life. So it's important to understand what the doctors are telling you and ask about, you know, that part, because that's the part that's the most important part, whether they're going to be conscious or not.
right. So ask questions and manage your expectations.
Yes, manage expectations for sure. Yeah, yeah. Because he never woke up. He spent 3 days in inpatient hospice, and once the medication started, he never woke up. Never woke up, and he was awake before the medications.
Right.
So,
And he, yeah,
but in pain and delirious and suffering. Yeah.
yeah.
So
Well, you know, Michael, thank you very much for sharing the story.
you're welcome.
That
You're welcome.
I appreciate the advice, and I'm hoping that
I mean, I'm
anyone.
glad. I'm glad hospice exists. I am, even though like I've had some trauma with it and issues with it. The fact that you know that there is something out there that can alleviate someone's pain during the dying process, um, is great, because just thinking about people spending 8 or 9 or 10 weeks suffering in a rehab or in a nursing home where they won't get like palliated care. They're not going to give them, like when someone is being treated, they're not going to give them medications that will address the pain in a substantial manner, because then that could kill them and they're open to lawsuits. And so the fact that they're able to tolerate or manage the pain better in hospice, I mean, it's good to know. It's good to know.
Yeah, and I appreciate you sharing, because I think, like we were talking before the interview, there are so many people out there who don't understand hospice.
Right,
know I personally didn't understand it before I started working with hospice.
right.
Um, that these benefits even exist, you know?
Yeah, yeah. No, there are definitely benefits, but you have to be ready for it too. You have to be ready for it. And I think with me, I was so scared about sending him back to a nursing home and with a feeding tube that it felt like it was the only like humane choice for him. It was only the only humane choice for him at his age. So, you know, but still, it's very difficult. You still deal with the decision, because you're deciding, on someone's life.
Yep.
You're deciding someone's life, you know. So you live with that. You do live with it. So
But, I mean, it sounds to me that you made the best decision that you could at the time.
yeah, yep,
What you
yep,
had. So,
yep,
um,
yep.
could I ask you a question about you? You brought
Sure.
up the point. You're deciding. Did your dad ever do a living will or advance directive?
He
Did you guys?
did, but that was like 40 years ago, and he didn't even know what was in it. He
Okay.
had no idea what was in it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But with my mother, it's different, because I've asked her specifically over the last few years. I know she doesn't want a feeding tube. I know she doesn't want any of this stuff. With her, even though it's going to be hard, I know exactly what she wants. I know exactly and what she doesn't want,
And you think that
so
would make it easier to make the decision?
I think it
That
will
you
make
could,
it easier. I mean, with her, like I mentioned to you, she was sick with the coronavirus recently, and I was already thinking, oh God, I'm not going to have them put her on a ventilator at her age at 89. And so I actually called the same hospice that my father was in to see, once she came home, if I could transfer her, even though she was not at a point where she was dying. If at some point I can transfer her to hospice when I felt like it was more needed, because there was no way I was going to call an ambulance and send her to a New York City hospital with coronavirus and without us being there. I would much rather have hospice come to the house and bring her oxygen.
right.
So I have that as a plan B if this pandemic gets worse.
Right.
So
Well,
yeah,
I'm glad that your mom's doing better and
yeah, yeah,
over that. Um,
yeah. It's good.
yeah.
Good.
But thanks so much, Michael. And is there anything
Thank you.
to add in there before?
No, no, I just think that, just do a lot of research, talk to a lot of people. I found the Facebook groups really, really, really helpful, because a lot of people are either working in hospice or been through hospice. And I think that people can really give you a lot of guidance. I've had post after my father died, I've used those Facebook groups as grief therapy. And a lot of people just confirmed, that my decision was the right decision, sharing their own stories. So I just think you have to really be educated about all this stuff.
Right. Right. And I'm
Yeah.
glad that you utilize the groups because they are there for support. And I think we learn a lot from each other just by asking our questions,
Yeah.
putting our
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, thank you very much. Take care.
thanks, Michael.